Okay, so like imagine trying to keep up with everything happening in Myanmar.
Yeah.
You know, it's just constant chaos, right?
It really is.
So how do you cut through all the noise and figure out what's actually important?
Well, that's kind of what we're doing here.
That's right. We're doing a deep dive into this week's Mizzima Weekly magazine.
Yeah. It's like a cheat sheet for understanding the Myanmar crisis.
Exactly. And, you know, with so much going on in the world, it's easy to miss what's happening over there.
Oh, absolutely.
So we've got an expert with us today to help us unpack all this.
Happy to be here.
You always do such a great job of connecting the dots, like making sense of these really complex situations.
Well, I try my best.
So in this issue, I mean, there's a lot to cover, right? We've got the military junta still clinging to power, but they're facing all this international pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the impact on ordinary people is just devastating.
It really is.
I mean,
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking to read about what they're going through. But there are also some really interesting developments, like the Arakan Army basically taking control of Rakhine State.
That's right. They're really on the rise.
And then you've got the Rohingya crisis, which is still such a tragedy.
Absolutely.
Bangladesh is blocking refugees at the border. And now we're seeing some Rohingya actually joining militias that are fighting for the junta.
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation.
So there's a lot to unpack here.
There is.
Let's start with the editorial.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it basically argues that the world is forgetting about Myanmar.
Right.
They call it a forgotten conflict,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty strong statement.
It is, yeah.
Why do you think that is? I
Right.
mean, why is Myanmar slipping off the radar?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One is that there's so many other crises happening around the world, you know, Ukraine, the climate crisis.
Right.
It's hard to keep up with everything. And then there's also a sense of what some call compassion fatigue.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
People just get overwhelmed by all the suffering in the world and they kind of tune out.
It's like they shut down to protect themselves.
Exactly. And then there's also skepticism about whether intervention actually works. You know, some people feel like nothing can really be done to change the situation in Myanmar.
So they just give up.
In a way, yeah, it's understandable, but it's also really tragic.
I think so, too. So what does the editorial propose as solutions? Like, how do we get the world to pay attention again?
Well, they talk about a few things. One is more pressure from the UN, you know, resolutions, sanctions, things like that.
Okay.
They also call for ASEAN to take a stronger stance.
Which is interesting because ASEAN has been kind of hesitant to get involved.
Right. They're all about non-interference, but I think there's a growing sense that they need to do more.
And, of course, targeted sanctions are always on the table.
Yeah. But sanctions are tricky, you know. They can hurt ordinary people more than the regime.
That's always the concern, right?
Exactly. So it's about finding the right balance. And then, of course, the editorial emphasizes the importance of media coverage.
Yes.
You know, keeping the spotlight on Myanmar, telling the stories of what's happening there. Because that's what really moves people, you know? It's those human stories that connect us to the crisis.
It's like you were saying earlier about the compassion fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
If we can connect with the people on a human level, it's harder to turn away.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, the editorial is basically a call to action, you know. Don't forget about Myanmar. Don't let it become a forgotten conflict.
I think that's a really important message.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's realistic, though? I mean, can we really expect the world to suddenly shift its attention back to Myanmar?
It's a tough question. I think it's going to take a lot of work. You know, a lot of people speaking out, sharing information, putting pressure on government.
So it's like a grassroots movement.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think Mizzima Weekly is playing a really important role in that, you know. They're providing the information, the platform, the stories that can help mobilize people.
I agree. So for our listeners out there, I mean, I'm curious, what do you think? Do you feel like Myanmar is a forgotten conflict? And if so, what can we do about it?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what people think, too.
All right, let's move on to another big story in this issue. The peace talks between the junta and the TNLA.
Right.
This is one that really caught my eye.
Mine, too.
I mean, it's a pretty significant development, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, the TNLA has been fighting for autonomy for decades.
Right, and they've been pretty successful lately, too.
Yeah, they've gained a lot of ground.
So now they're saying they're open to peace talks. But there's a lot of skepticism.
Oh, yeah. Why?
People are wondering, is the junta actually serious about this?
That's the big question.
Or are they just trying to, you know, divide and weaken the resistance?
It wouldn't be the first time.
Exactly.
And then there's the whole issue of China's influence.
Ah, yes, China.
They're definitely a factor here.
So tell me more about that. What role is China playing in all of this?
Well, China has a lot of interests in Myanmar. They share a border, they have huge investments there.
Right.
So stability is really important to them. And they seem to be pushing for some kind of resolution to the conflict.
Do you think they're actually supporting the peace talks, though? Or are they just trying to protect their own interests?
It's probably a bit of both, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They want to see an end to the fighting, but they also want to make sure that the outcome is favorable to them.
So it's like they're playing both sides.
In a way, yeah.
Which is kind of typical of China, I guess.
It is, yeah. But it makes it really hard to know what their true intentions are.
I mean, do you think they have the power to actually influence the peace process?
Oh, they definitely have the leverage. They're Myanmar's biggest trading partner. They provide a lot of military support.
Right.
So they could put a lot of pressure on the junta if they wanted to.
But the question is, will they?
Exactly. And that's what everyone's watching to see.
And then you've got the TNLA. I mean, what's their motivation here? Why are they suddenly open to peace talks?
Well, I think there are a few factors at play. One is that they've been pretty successful militarily. They've gained a lot of territory.
Right.
So they're in a strong position to negotiate.
That makes sense.
And they might also be feeling pressure from China, to come to the table.
So it's like everyone's got their own agenda?
Exactly. And it's
Yeah.
all playing out against this backdrop of violence and human suffering.
Yeah, that's what I keep coming back to. I mean, reading this issue of MizzimaTV Weekly,
Yeah.
it's just so clear how much the people of Myanmar are hurting.
It's really devastating.
There's a story in here about a junta airstrike that hit a tea shop.
Oh, yeah, I read that one.
11 people were killed, just like that.
It's awful.
And this is happening all the time. you know?
Yeah.
People are being killed, arrested, tortured.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a constant state of terror.
It really is.
And it makes these peace talks seem even more urgent.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if they can actually achieve some kind of ceasefire, some kind of reduction in violence,
Right.
that would be a huge step forward.
It would be a miracle.
It would, yeah. But it's hard to be optimistic when you see what's happening on the ground.
I know what you mean. It's like you want to believe that peace is possible, but then you read these stories and it's just so disheartening.
It is, yeah. But I think it's important to hold on to that hope,
I agree.
even if it's just a flicker.
Because without hope, I mean, what's the point?
Exactly. We have to believe that things can get better.
Okay, so we've talked about the junta, we've talked about the TNLA, we've talked about China,
Mm-hmm.
but there's another key player in all of this that we haven't mentioned yet,
The Rohingya.
the Rohingya.
Right.
Their situation is just tragic.
It's beyond tragic.
I mean, they've been persecuted for decades,
yeah.
forced to flee their homes, live in refugee camps.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're seeing some of them actually joining militias
Mm-hmm.
that are fighting for the junta.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. I mean, can you imagine being so desperate that you would join forces with the very people who've been oppressing you?
It's hard to fathom.
So what's driving this? Why are some Rohingya joining these militias?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. One is desperation. They're living in these terrible conditions in the refugee camps. They have no hope for the future.
Right.
So when someone comes along and offers them food money, a sense of purpose,
They're willing to take it.
even if it means fighting alongside their oppressors.
It's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
They are, yeah. And it's just another way that the junta is exploiting this crisis.
Manipulating people?
Exactly, using them as pawns in their power struggle.
It's sickening.
It is. And it's just one more reason why the world needs to pay attention to what's happening in Myanmar.
I agree. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the other stories in this issue of MizzimaTV Weekly.
Okay.
There's a really interesting piece about the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for Min Aung Hlaing.
Yeah, the junta leader.
Right? I mean,
Right.
that's huge, right?
It is symbolically, yeah.
But realistically, will it actually lead to his arrest?
Probably not. He's not going to just surrender himself. And no one's going to go into Myanmar and drag him out.
So what's the point?
Well, it's a statement, you
Yeah.
know.
Okay.
It's the international community saying that we see what you're doing.
We're not going to let you get away with it.
Exactly. And it also gives hope to the victims,
The Rohingya especially.
Right. It shows them that justice is possible, even if it's a long way off.
So it's like a moral victory.
In a way, yeah. But it's still a victory.
I like that. Okay, so another story that caught my eye is the one about Primark.
Oh, yeah, the fast fashion company.
Right. They're actually trying to do some ethical sourcing in Myanmar.
Which is kind of surprising, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, fast fashion is not exactly known for its ethical practices.
No, not really.
So it's interesting to see a company like Primark actually making an effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we have to be cautious, you know?
Okay.
It's easy for companies to make promises,
Right.
but the real test is whether they actually follow through.
So how do we know if they're being genuine?
Well, I think transparency is key, you know? Being open about their supply chains, allowing independent audits.
So we can see what's really going on.
Exactly. And I think consumer pressure is also really important.
Like boycotts and things like that.
Yeah, or even just asking questions, you know?
Like contacting the companies and saying, hey, what are you doing about this?
Exactly. Because ultimately, these companies respond to consumer demand.
That's true. So it's up to us to hold them accountable.
It is, yeah. We have to let them know that we care about where our clothes come from.
And that we're not going to support companies that are exploiting workers.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's one more story I want to touch on before we wrap up.
Okay.
It's the one about the pregnant women in Karenni State who are struggling to get health care.
Oh, yeah. That was a tough one to read.
It was.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking to think about these women who are trying to bring new life into the world, but they're facing all these obstacles.
Yeah, the healthcare system is basically collapsed.
Right. There are shortages of medicine and supplies.
And the junta is actively targeting healthcare workers.
It's like they're trying to punish people for getting sick.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's just cruel.
So what can be done to help these women?
Well, there are organizations that are trying to provide medical assistance.
Okay.
But it's really difficult to reach people in conflict zones.
Right, because it's so dangerous.
Exactly. And the junta is often blocking aid.
So it's like a catch-22.
It is. And it's just another example of how the junta's policies are harming the most vulnerable people in Myanmar.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the politics of all of this, but we have to remember that there are real people who are suffering.
Yes.
And their lives are being destroyed by this conflict.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to keep talking about it, to keep raising awareness.
Because the world needs to know what's happening in Myanmar.
Exactly.
And we can't let it become a forgotten crisis.
No, we can't. It's really important, you know, to keep that spotlight on Myanmar.
I totally agree. And speaking of keeping the spotlight on Myanmar, I think we should talk about the role of Mizzima Media.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, they're really risking their lives to report on this crisis.
They are. It's incredibly brave.
And they're doing such a good job of providing independent news and information.
They really are. It's a vital resource for people inside Myanmar and for those of us who are trying to understand what's happening from the outside.
And I think it's important to remember that independent journalism is under threat all over the world.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But especially in places like Myanmar where the government controls the media.
Right.
So Mizzima Media is playing an even more crucial role.
Absolutely. They're providing a platform for dissenting voices for people who are being silenced by the junta.
And they're holding the powerful accountable.
Exactly. They're not afraid to expose corruption and human rights abuses.
So for our listeners out there, I mean, if you want to support independent journalism in Myanmar, if you want to help keep Mizzima Media going, I highly encourage you to subscribe to Mizzima Weekly.
Yeah, it's a great way to stay informed about what's happening and to support the people who are risking their lives to bring us the truth.
And, you know, it's not just about the news.
Right.
Mizzima Weekly also features really insightful analysis and opinion pieces.
They do. They have some great writers.
And they cover a wide range of topics, you know, politics, economics, culture.
And they have amazing photography, too.
Oh, yeah, the photos are incredible.
Really powerful.
So it's a great way to get a deeper understanding of Myanmar.
It is. It's like a window into the country.
And I think it's something that everyone who cares about this crisis should check out.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to say thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's always great to talk to you and to get your insights.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
And to our listeners out there, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
We hope you found this deep dive informative and maybe even inspiring.
Yeah, hopefully it's given you a better understanding of what's happening in Myanmar.
And if you're feeling overwhelmed by all of this, I mean, it's a lot to take in.
It is.
Just remember that you're not alone.
Right?
There are people all over the world who care about this crisis.
And who are working to make a difference.
So don't give up hope.
Yeah, keep fighting for what's right.
And keep supporting the people of Myanmar.
Absolutely.